The room went completely silent. Not the polite silence of a crowd waiting for the next act. The dangerous kind. The kind that falls when something happens that nobody expected, and nobody knows how to stop. Joon stood at the edge of the mezzanine, one hand gripping the railing, the other hanging loose at his side. His whiskey sat untouched on the table behind him. His bodyguards exchanged glances but said nothing. They had worked for this man for years. They had watched him order violence without blinking. They had seen him close deals worth millions without a single change in his expression. They had never seen him grip a railing. Down on the stage below, Susan Rose was still moving. She had no idea who was watching her. She had no idea that the most powerful and most dangerous man in Seoul had stopped breathing the moment she stepped into the light. She only knew the music. She only knew the floor beneath her feet and the fire burning in her chest, and the rhythm that had lived inside her bones since she was a little girl running barefoot through the streets of Cape Town. She danced like she had something to prove, like she had something to lose. Like this moment, this single unexpected moment in a city that had taken everything from her, was the one thing she refused to surrender. Joon watched her and felt something crack open inside his chest. He didn't have a name for it yet. But he would. Welcome to Afro-K Romance Fairy Tale. On today's episode you get a dose of betrayal, power, romance, love, unexpected encounters and a beautiful beginning. If this is your first time here, make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification icon to get a reminder when new amazing stories drop, and send this story to friends and family who you think would love to watch it. And also tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. Now let's dive back into this amazing story. Susan Rose had not planned on being in Seoul. She had not planned on being broke in Seoul. She had not planned on standing in a city of neon lights and cold winters with exactly one contact in her phone who had stopped responding 3 weeks ago, a suitcase that held everything she owned, and a pride so stubborn it had once cost her a perfectly good relationship back home in Cape Town. But here she was. The dance contract that brought her across the ocean had seemed legitimate. A mid-size K-pop agency. A 6-month performance contract. Good money. The kind of opportunity that only comes once, and only to the ones brave enough or reckless enough to reach for it. Susan had packed her bags in 48 hours. She had kissed her mother on the cheek, told her best friend not to worry, and boarded a plane to a country whose language she did not speak, whose customs she did not know, and whose winters, she would later discover, were not for the unprepared. The agency collapsed before her first rehearsal. The director disappeared. The office emptied overnight. Susan showed up on a Monday morning to find a locked door and 3 other dancers from different countries standing in the hallway wearing the same stunned expression she imagined was on her own face. She did not cry. She had not been raised for crying. She had been raised by a woman who built a business with 2 hands and no help in one of Cape Town's most unforgiving neighborhoods. Tears were not in the toolkit. So Susan straightened her back, picked up her suitcase and started walking. She found a small apartment through a listing app. She stretched her savings further than they had any right to go. She auditioned for 3 different companies in 2 weeks and came close twice. But close in Seoul's entertainment industry is just another word for no. It was during the 3rd week, hungry and running low on options, that she met Ji-young. Ji-young was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s who spoke English with a British accent she had picked up from a drama teacher in Busan. She worked at Secret Palace, a members-only lounge buried below street level in one of Gangnam's quietest and most expensive streets. The kind of place that did not advertise. The kind of place you only knew about if someone who mattered had already told you. Ji-young told Susan they needed serving staff. Discreet. Professional. Presentable. Susan needed money. She took the job. She wore the uniform. All black, simple, elegant. She learned the protocols. Keep your eyes down when the private tables are occupied. Do not make conversation unless spoken to first. Never ask the names of the men in the back rooms. Never repeat what you hear. Susan followed every rule without complaint. She was good at disappearing into the background when she needed to. What she did not know, what nobody bothered to tell her, was who owned Secret Palace. She had been working there for 11 days before she found out. And by then it was already too late. The night everything changed was not supposed to be special. It was a Friday. The lounge was full but not chaotic. The usual crowd, men in suits that cost more than most people's rent, women draped in quiet luxury, conversations happening in low voices over expensive glasses of things Susan could not afford to taste. She moved through the room the way she always did. Invisible, efficient, careful. Then the manager grabbed her arm. His name was Mr. Beck. A thin, nervous man who sweated through his collar on good days and practically dissolved on bad ones. Tonight he looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. "The performer," he said, pulling Susan toward the back corridor. She collapsed. "Food poisoning. She cannot go on." Susan stared at him. "That has nothing to do with me." "You dance," he said. It was not a question. Ji-young had mentioned it. Susan had no idea why. "I have seen videos. You are good." "I serve drinks," Susan said flatly. "Please." He said that word the way a drowning man reaches for anything floating. "Just 10 minutes. Just move. The crowd is restless, and there are people in this room tonight that we cannot afford to disappoint." Susan looked past him toward the stage. Intimate. A single spotlight already burning over an empty floor like it was waiting for something. She thought about her rent. She thought about the email she had drafted and deleted 4 times to her mother. She thought about what it meant to have come this far and still be invisible. She pulled her arm free from Mr. Beck's grip. 10 minutes, she said. She did not know what music was going to play. She did not ask. When the first notes dropped from the speakers, that unmistakable bass line, that sharp percussive snap, something inside her simply ignited. Her body knew that sound before her mind could process it. Michael Jackson's Billie Jean. But the DJ, reading something in the room, began to layer it. Afrobeat beneath it. A percussion underneath the percussion. Something that made the familiar feel ancestral. Susan stepped into the light. And she stopped being a struggling dancer in a borrowed uniform in a city that had not been kind to her. She became something else entirely. Every isolation. Every sharp pop of her shoulder. Every slow drag of her foot across the floor that built into a moonwalk so clean it made 2 women at the front table audibly gasp. But it was not just technical. It was the feeling underneath it. The frustration she had swallowed for weeks. The loneliness she had refused to name. The pride that had kept her upright when everything around her tilted. It all came out through her body, and it was beautiful, and it was raw, and it was the kind of dancing that makes a room forget to breathe. Nobody in Secret Palace made a sound. Nobody except the man on the mezzanine above. Joon had arrived that evening for a meeting, one of several he held each week in the private upper level of the lounge he owned through 3 layers of corporate cover. He was not there for entertainment. He was never there for entertainment. Business was the only language he spoke fluently and the only one he trusted. He had been mid-sentence when the music started. His associate kept talking. Joon stopped listening. He rose from his seat. Slowly, the way a man moves when he does not want to draw attention to the fact that something has pulled him, and walked to the edge of the mezzanine. He looked down. Susan Rose was in the middle of the floor below, and she was breaking something open in a room full of people who had forgotten they were supposed to be composed. Joon stood completely still. He was 39 years old. He had built an empire on the ability to assess everything quickly and feel nothing deeply. He could read a man's intentions in the first 7 seconds of a handshake. He could calculate risk the way other people calculated change. He had been described in 3 different countries using 3 different languages, and every description contained the same core word: cold. He did not feel cold right now. He felt something he had no current vocabulary for. Something that started in his chest and moved outward. Something that made the mezzanine feel smaller than it was, and the distance between himself and the woman on that stage feel both vast and unbearable. His bodyguard, Choi, stepped quietly beside him. "Sir, Mr. Lim is still waiting." Joon did not move. "Sir, tell him to wait." Choi blinked. In 6 years he had never heard those words. Joon did not make people wait. People waited for Joon. That was simply the order of the world. Below, Susan finished her last sequence. She stood in the center of the spotlight, chest rising and falling, chin lifted. Not performing anymore. Just existing in the aftermath of something real. The room erupted. Joon did not clap. He turned to Choi with an expression Choi had never seen on that face before. Not quite hunger, not quite decision, something sitting exactly between the two, and said 4 words quietly. Who is she? Find out. Choi nodded and moved. Joon turned back to the railing and looked down at the stage again. Susan was already walking off, her back straight, her chin still high. She did not look up. She had no reason to. She had no idea she had just walked into the center of a man's world and rearranged everything in it without touching a single thing. She had no idea that by morning, Joon would know her full name, her nationality, her address, her financial situation, and every detail of the collapsed agency that had brought her to Seoul. And she had absolutely no idea that he had already made a decision about her. He just had not told her yet. Susan did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the adrenaline. The performance had pulled something out of her that she had been keeping carefully stored away. The part of her that loved dancing not for contracts or money or approval, but for the sheer unbearable joy of it. Letting that out in a room full of strangers had felt dangerously close to being seen. And being seen, Susan had learned, was where trouble always started. She made tea at 2 in the morning and sat by her small window watching Seoul move below her. This city never fully slept. There was always light somewhere. Always motion. She had come to find that both comforting and unsettling. The way you can feel completely alone in the middle of something that never stops moving. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ji Young. Mr. Beck wants you back tomorrow night. Same role. He is offering triple your usual rate. Susan read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table and finished her tea. Triple rate meant bills paid. Triple rate meant she could breathe for another month without drafting that email to her mother. Triple rate was not something a woman in her position turned down because of a feeling she could not explain. She picked the phone back up. Tell him yes. She arrived the next evening to find Secret Palace subtly different. Nothing she could point to directly. The same dim lighting. The same low music. The same careful choreography of wealth moving through a space designed to make wealth feel comfortable. But the staff moved with a slightly higher tension in their shoulders. Mr. Beck greeted her at the door instead of leaving her to sign in at the back. He was wearing a newer suit. You'll have a dressing room tonight, he said. And we've arranged proper costuming. Susan stopped walking. Why? He smiled the smile of a man delivering news he did not fully understand himself. Special guest request. She should have asked more questions. She knew that later. But the dressing room had a mirror with proper lighting and the costume. Deep burgundy, elegant, nothing excessive. Fit like it had been made for her measurements. And Susan Rose, who had been invisible for weeks in a city that did not know her name, stood in front of that mirror and felt something dangerously close to power. She walked onto the stage that night like she belonged there. 'Cause she did. What she did not see, what she was not meant to see, was the slight reorganization of the mezzanine above. The private table had been repositioned 2 feet closer to the railing. The angle now gave a perfect unobstructed view of the entire stage below. And seated at that table, alone, with no associate and no open file and no business waiting, was Joon. He had cancelled 2 meetings to be there. Nobody knew that except Choi, who had learned in 6 years that some things about this man were better stored in silence. Susan felt the shift in the room halfway through her second song. It was not something she could explain technically. Performers develop a sensitivity to audience energy. The way a room breathes changes depending on who is in it and what they are carrying. Something above her felt different tonight. Focused in a way that was specific rather than general. Like a single point of attention so concentrated it had weight. She did not look up. She kept dancing. But the awareness settled into her skin and stayed there. After the performance, Mr. Beck appeared at her dressing room door with an envelope and an expression that was working very hard at being neutral. Your payment, he said. And a message. He handed her a small card. Cream-colored. Heavy stock. No logo. 2 lines of text in clean print. Dinner. Tomorrow. p.m. A car will come. No name. No question mark. Susan turned the card over. Blank on the back. Who sent this? She asked. Mr. Beck straightened his collar. The owner of this establishment. The room felt smaller suddenly. Susan looked at the card again. The owner. She had worked here for nearly 2 weeks, and the word owner had floated around Secret Palace like a ghost. Present, influential, shaping everything, but never visible. Never named in her presence. And if I say no? She asked. Mr. Beck's expression shifted into something that was not quite a warning but was not quite not one either. I would encourage you, he said carefully, to consider the invitation seriously. He left her alone with the card. Susan sat in front of the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at her was beautiful and capable, and had survived harder things than a dinner invitation from a man who signed his messages with nothing but certainty. But something in the weight of that card in her hand told her this was not simply dinner. This was a door. And doors like this, the heavy ones, the ones that open into rooms you cannot see from the outside, they do not swing both ways equally. She could feel that without being able to explain it. She put the card in her bag anyway. She went. Of course she went. Not because she was told to. Not because Mr. Beck's careful non-warning had frightened her into it. Susan Rose did not frighten easily, and she did not take instructions from men who could not look her in the eye when they delivered them. She went because something in her, the same instinct that had made her board a plane alone to a country she did not know, the same fire that had carried her onto that stage 2 nights running, told her that whatever was on the other side of this particular door was something she needed to see. The car arrived exactly at 8. Black. Long. A driver who opened the door without speaking and closed it without looking at her. They drove for 20 minutes through parts of Seoul she did not recognize. Quieter streets, older money, the kind of neighborhood that does not need to announce itself. The restaurant was private. Not a restaurant in the usual sense. A single room, a single table, floor-to-ceiling glass on one side looking over the Han River at night. Set for 2. Candle lit. Utterly silent except for the low movement of staff who appeared and disappeared like they had been trained to be furniture. Joon was already seated. Susan saw him and understood immediately why nobody said his name casually. He was not the largest man in any room he had probably ever entered. He was not loud. He wore a dark suit with the ease of a man who had stopped thinking about what he wore a long time ago. But there was something in the way he occupied space. Completely, deliberately, like the room had been arranged around him rather than him placed inside it, that made everything else feel peripheral. He looked at her when she entered. He did not smile. He simply looked, with the full and undivided attention of a man who had decided she was worth looking at, and something about that gaze made Susan's step slow just slightly before she caught herself and kept walking. She sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Joon said in clean, careful English, "You dance like you're angry at something." Susan held his gaze. "Maybe I am." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more controlled than that. Something that suggested he found her answer not just acceptable but interesting. "Good," he said quietly. "Anger is honest." And just like that, without her permission, without her planning, without any part of her being ready for it, the conversation began. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Secret Palace. Not about the card or the car or the careful machinery that had delivered her to this table. They talked about Cape Town and Seoul. About what it costs to want something badly enough to cross an ocean for it. About music. Joon knew more about it than she expected and listened more carefully than most people she had ever met. He asked questions and then actually waited for the answers. He did not interrupt. He did not perform interest. He simply had it, and it was more disarming than anything Susan had prepared herself for. She had come ready for power, for pressure, for the particular arrogance of wealthy men who mistake access for attraction. She had not come ready for this. She had not come ready for a man who looked at her like she was the most coherent thing in a world that had stopped making sense to him. Quietly, carefully, like he was afraid that looking too directly might make her disappear. Danger, Susan Rose knew, did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sat across a candlelit table and made you feel, for the first time in months, completely and devastatingly understood. She drove home alone at midnight. Joon had not touched her, had not tried, had not said anything that could be directly named as inappropriate. But when she got back to her small apartment and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, her heart was beating like she had just run from something. Or toward it. She could not yet tell which. And here is where it gets complicated. Because the next morning, Susan received a visitor she was not expecting. Someone from Joon's world who had come with a very specific message. Not from him. About him. And what they told her should have made her leave Seoul on the next available flight. Before we get into part 4, I need to know something from you. Comment below and tell me. Would you have stayed or left after what they told her? Drop your answer and tell me which city you're watching from. Now let's keep going. The visitor was a woman. She arrived at Susan's apartment at 9 in the morning without a call, without a warning, without anything except a sharp knock and the kind of stillness that sits on people who have learned to deliver difficult things without flinching. She was Korean, mid-40s, dressed simply but with the posture of someone who had once occupied expensive rooms. Her English was precise. Her name was Mrs. Han. She did not ask to come in. Susan let her in anyway. They sat at the small table by the window where Susan had drunk her tea 2 nights ago, and the woman placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at Susan with eyes that carried something between pity and urgency. You had dinner with Joon last night, she said. Not a question. Susan kept her face still. Who are you? Someone who was close to the last woman. He looked at the way he looked at you on that stage. He paused. She is not in Seoul anymore. She is not in Korea anymore. She left with nothing. No money, no phone, no explanation. And nobody who works for him will say her name. The apartment felt very quiet. Susan looked at this woman and understood she was not performing. There was no angle here. No competitor trying to clear a path. This was something rawer than that. A warning delivered by someone who had watched something happen and could not live with having stayed silent the second time. What are you telling me to do? Susan asked. I am telling you what happened, Mrs. Han said carefully. What you do is your own choice. She stood, straightened her jacket, looked at Susan one final time with an expression that held something almost maternal in it. The particular grief of a woman watching a younger one stand at the edge of something irreversible. Then she left. Susan sat alone at the table for a very long time. She should have packed her bag. Every rational part of her, the part her mother had sharpened, the part that had kept her upright through the collapsed contract and the empty bank account and the endless auditions that went nowhere, that part knew exactly what to do. Leave. Walk away from Secret Palace and the cream-colored card and the man who looked at her like she was the only coherent thing in a world that had stopped making sense to him. She knew all of this. She went to Secret Palace that evening anyway. Not for the money. She stopped lying to herself about that on the drive over. She went because something Mrs. Han had said was sitting in her chest at a strange angle, the way he looked at you on that stage, and Susan needed to understand what that meant. She needed to look at Joon again with what she now knew and see if it changed what she felt. She needed to know if what she felt was real or if she was simply the next woman standing in a pattern she could not yet see the full shape of. He was there. Same mezzanine. Same stillness. But tonight something was different. He came downstairs. Susan saw him cross the main floor of Secret Palace with Choi 2 steps behind him, and the room responded the way rooms respond to men like Joon, which is to say that conversations dimmed slightly and bodies shifted, and everyone found a reason to be looking somewhere else without making it obvious they were tracking his movement. He walked directly to her. Not to Mr. Beck. Not to a table. To her. Walk with me, he said. It was that same quality his written invitation had carried. Not a question. But tonight, knowing what she knew, Susan heard something underneath the certainty. Something that might have been, in a different man with different walls, closer to please. She walked with him. They went through a side corridor she had never used and out through a door that opened onto a narrow private terrace overlooking a courtyard below. The cold air hit her immediately. Seoul at night in this season carried a particular bite. Joon shrugged off his jacket without a word and held it out to her. Susan stared at it. "I am not cold," she said. "You are," he said simply. "Take it." She took it. She hated that it was warm and that it smelled like something quiet and expensive and that putting it on felt dangerously natural. They stood at the railing looking down at the courtyard for a moment without speaking. Then Susan turned to face him. "Who was she?" she asked. Joon went very still. Not the controlled stillness he wore like armor in public. Something different. The stillness of a man who has been asked the exact question he has been both dreading and waiting for. "Mrs. Han came to see you," he said. It was not a question either. "Answer mine first." He looked at her for a long moment. The courtyard below was quiet. Somewhere distant, Seoul hummed and moved and continued being enormous and indifferent to the two people standing in this small pocket of cold air trying to decide how honest to be with each other. "Her name was Yuna," he said finally. "She worked here. I thought." He stopped. Something crossed his face that looked almost unfamiliar on it. Not quite pain, but the shadow pain leaves behind. "I was not careful with what I felt. And the world I operate in does not forgive that. She became a target. Not because of anything she did. Because of me." Susan held his gaze. "What happened to her?" "I got her out," he said quietly. "Before anything did. New name. New city. New life with enough money that she will never need anything again." He paused. "She is safe. She is simply gone." The cold air moved between them. "And you think that makes it better?" Susan asked. "No," he said. "I think it makes it survivable. There is a difference." Susan turned back to the railing. Her chest was doing something complicated. Because this was the moment she had come for. The moment she looked at this man with full information and waited to feel warned away. And instead what she felt was something far more inconvenient. Something that recognized in Joon's carefully controlled face the same thing she carried in her own chest. The specific exhaustion of someone who has learned to want things quietly because wanting things loudly has cost them before. She did not want to feel that. She felt it anyway. "You should have told me yourself," she said. "Yes," he agreed. No deflection. No defense. Just the word, clean and unguarded. Falling into the space between them like something he had already decided to stop protecting. Susan looked at him. In Cape Town she had loved a man who was always performing certainty. Who spoke loudly about his feelings and delivered nothing behind the volume. Joon had not said a single word tonight that sounded like a declaration. He had simply stood in the cold and told her the truth and waited with the patience of someone who understood he had no right to ask for anything in return. That undid her more than anything else could have. "This is a terrible idea," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "Your world is dangerous." "Yes. I am not Yuna. I will not disappear quietly if things go wrong." Something shifted in his expression then. Slow, careful, like light moving across a surface that has not seen it in a long time. "I know that too," he said. And the way he said it, not with relief but with something that sounded almost like recognition, like he had been waiting specifically for a woman who would say exactly that, made her breath catch in a way she did not try to hide. He reached out slowly. Gave her every moment to step back. And when she did not, he tucked a loose strand of hair away from her face with one careful finger. A gesture so small and so deliberate that it carried the weight of everything neither of them had said. Susan Rose stood on that terrace in Joon's jacket in the cold Seoul night, and understood that she had already made her decision. She had probably made it the moment she walked back into Secret Palace tonight. Maybe she had made it on the stage. Maybe it was never really a decision at all. But here is what Susan did not know yet. While she and Joon stood on that terrace, something was happening inside Secret Palace that would change the shape of everything they were carefully, dangerously beginning to build. One of Joon's own men, someone he trusted, someone who had sat at his table for years, had made a phone call. About Susan. About what she meant to Joon. About how to use that. The betrayal was already in motion. And it was coming from somewhere neither of them would ever have thought to look. The call lasted 4 minutes. The man who made it was named Park Sung, Joon's oldest lieutenant. 12 years at his side. 12 years of loyalty so consistent it had never once been questioned. Park Sung had been there when Joon built the first layer of the syndicate. He had been there through every rival, every negotiation, every moment of crisis that had tried to crack the Han River operation apart. He had smiled at Susan when she passed him in the corridor earlier that evening. She had smiled back. Now he sat in a back room of Secret Palace with his phone face down on the table and a deal in his chest that he had been carrying for 3 months. A deal with the Jong faction, Seoul's second most powerful criminal organization, who had been trying to find a crack in Joon's armor for years and had finally found one. Her name was Susan Rose. Park Sung had watched Joon cancel meetings for her. Had watched him come downstairs, something Joon did not do, and walk across a public floor to reach her. Had watched his face on that terrace through the interior glass with the expression of a man who had lowered every wall he had spent 15 years building. In their world that was not love. That was a weapon. And the Jong faction had offered Park Sung enough to disappear comfortably if he handed them the grip. He had told them about Susan, her apartment address, her schedule, the fact that she meant something to Joon that Yuna never quite had, that this one was different, that this one had gotten through in a way that left Joon genuinely exposed. The plan was simple and surgical. Take Susan. Not to harm her. They were not that reckless. Just long enough to send Joon a message about what it cost to hold territory they wanted. Just long enough to show him he was not untouchable. Park Sung told himself it was just business. He almost believed it. Susan felt it before she understood it. She was leaving Secret Palace at midnight. Joon had offered a car and she had declined, not ready yet to let him fold her into the logistics of his life, needing to walk back toward her own independence even as something between them had irrevocably shifted. The street outside was quiet. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She had his jacket still. She had forgotten to give it back and he had not reminded her, and she suspected neither of them had forgotten at all. She was half a block from the entrance when the black car pulled up beside her. Not Joon's car. Different plates. Different energy entirely. The door opened. A man she had never seen looked at her with the particular blankness of someone executing instructions rather than making decisions and said simply, "Get in." Susan did not get in. She stepped back. Looked at the car. Looked at the man. Measured the street. Empty in both directions, the nearest light 30 meters away. Her phone in her bag with Joon's number that she had saved without admitting to herself she was saving it. Ran. Not away from Secret Palace. Toward it. She hit the door at full speed and the security staff barely had time to register her before she was past them and moving through the lounge with her heart in her throat and every head turning as she crossed the floor without slowing. Joon appeared at the bottom of the mezzanine stairs. He saw her face and every trace of composure left his own. He crossed the room in seconds. His hands came to her arms, steadying, urgent. What happened? He told him. Fast and clear. Susan Rose did not spiral under pressure, she reported. Car. The man. The plates she had clocked out of instinct. Joon listened with the absolute focus of someone converting information directly into action. And before she had finished speaking he had already turned to Choi with something in his eyes that Choi had seen before, and that meant the temperature of the entire evening had just changed. Lock the building, Joon said quietly. And find Park Sung. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Choi's face moved. Sir. Find him. They found Park Sung still in the back room. He had not run. Susan later thought about that. He had made his call, set his plan in motion, and then simply sat and waited. The way a man waits when he has made a decision he cannot unmake and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. When Joon walked through that door with Choi behind him and 2 other men flanking the exit, Park Sung looked up and held his gaze. 12 years, Joon said. His voice was completely level. That was the most frightening thing about it. Park Sung said nothing. 12 years and you chose this. You changed, Park Sung said. His voice was steady too, but underneath it was something that might have been, in a different life, grief. The moment you started canceling meetings for a woman you met 3 weeks ago, you changed. And a changed man at the top of what we built is a risk I could not carry. Joon looked at him for a long moment. You should have come to me, he said finally. 12 years and you should have come to me. Park Sung looked away. That was the only answer he gave. Susan was in Joon's private office when he came back. She had been given tea she had not touched and a chair she had not sat in. She was standing at the window looking out at the courtyard below, the same courtyard they had looked at together from the terrace an hour ago, in a different version of this night. Joon came in and closed the door and they looked at each other across the room. He looked tired in a way she had not seen on him before. Not physically, something deeper. The particular exhaustion of a man who has just watched something he built crack from the inside. Are you hurt? He asked first. No. He crossed the room slowly and stood in front of her and looked at her face with that full, specific attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at her, like she was the thing in the room most worth looking at, always without apology. I am sorry, he said. This reached you because of me. I know, she said. I would understand. Joon. She said his name and the sound of it stopped him mid-sentence. She had never used it directly before. It did something to his expression. A small, involuntary shift, like a door opening slightly in a face that had kept everything shut for a very long time. She stepped closer. I ran back, she said quietly. I want you to understand what that means. I could have kept running. I know how to run. Instead I ran back here. Back to you. She held his gaze. So do not apologize for what your world is. Just be honest with me. Always. That is the only thing I am asking. Joon looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to carry everything neither of them had said yet. All the conversations still ahead, all the complications still waiting, all the weight of what it meant for a woman from Cape Town and a man who ran Seoul's underground to stand this close and choose each other with open eyes. Then he raised his hand and placed it carefully against her face. His thumb at her cheekbone, his palm warm against her jaw, and Susan let her eyes close for just a moment because the gentleness of it from a man like him was almost too much to hold. Always, he said quietly. A promise that cost him something. The kind that means more because you can hear what it took to make it. She opened her eyes. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. And in the private office of Secret Palace, in the city that had taken everything from her and then given her something she had never planned for, Susan Rose made the choice that every rational instinct had argued against and every true instinct had been moving toward since the moment she stepped into a spotlight that was never meant for her. She stayed. Not every love story begins in a place that makes sense. Some begin on a stage in a borrowed uniform in a city that does not know your name. Some begin with a man gripping a railing above you while his world realigns itself around something he cannot control. Some begin exactly where they should not, in the middle of danger and power and all the complicated, costly, beautiful things that happen when two people who have learned to want things quietly finally find someone worth wanting loudly. Susan Rose came to Seoul chasing a contract. She found something that had no contract, no safety clause, no guaranteed ending. But she ran back. And Joon, a man who had built an empire on feeling nothing, stood in the cold and told the truth and waited. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Now I want to hear from you. Would you have run back, or kept running? And do you think Joon can truly keep Susan safe in a world that will keep testing that promise? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved something in you, if you felt Susan's fire or Joon's careful, devastating tenderness, share this with someone who needs a story today. Like this video. Subscribe to Afro-K Romance Fairy Tale so you never miss what comes next. Because this is only the beginning of Susan and Joon. And what comes next, what the Jong faction does when their plan fails, and what secret Joon has been keeping even from himself, will change everything you think you know about this story. See you in the next episode.